All right guys, a super exciting day on the channel. If you're a regular viewer, you will know that cockpit setup has been a hot topic in the last many videos over the last year or so. And thankfully, my friends over at Raceface have connected me with my new homie, Joel. He is an amazing bike coach. He does some bike fitting and he's a great person to chat about cockpit setup with. So today we're gonna dive super deep into this, try to provide you guys with tons of value on how you can better set up your bikes. I hope you get a ton out of today's video. This has been a ton of fun getting to hang out with Joel today. I really hope you enjoy this. So I'm gonna toss it off to Joel now, and why don't you tell us a bit about you?
Cool, thanks. So like Peter was saying, my name is Joel and I'm a coach from Squamish, BC, and I've been doing it for a little over 20 years now. And my background is more on the physiology side and more on the skill coaching side. And so really just kind of excited to hang out today, talk a little bit more about these Raceface setups and see what we can learn.
Yeah, so essentially what we're here to talk about today, and what you guys will know from the title and thumbnail of the video, is we're gonna be talking about handlebar setup. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, you'll know that this is something that I'm pretty passionate about. In my last RE Tim Peak bike build, you'll know that I talked all about how I cut the fork last, so that way I can get the exact angle from my spindle up to the bar that I want right off the get-go from the bike build with no guessing. And if you watched, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, I uploaded a video all measuring my rider area distance and rider area distance angle. So this is something that is really core to like what has helped me, I guess I would say, improve my bike fit. And it's something that Joel's really knowledgeable about. So what would you say, I guess let's start with, what kind of role do you think bike handlebar rise fits into your coaching? Like what would you kind of recommend to people in starting? Maybe let's start with like where you would see a low rise bar fit. So you're running 10 mil?
Is that? This is a 20.
20? So you're running a 20 mil rise bar. So why don't you talk about that and where you see that and fit in your bike setup?
Yeah, so I think just, setup in general, my opinion would be it's gonna be specific to the terrain that somebody rides primarily, and then also specific to that person's general body position. And so constantly what we're doing with Blueprint athletes is we're working with both of those things. So if we adjust somebody's body position on the bike, well, if we don't make the change with the bike itself, then there's gonna be a deficiency somewhere. And so there's always a bit of give and take between the two. And so in this particular instance, I'm running a 20 mil rise bar, and I'm running a very low front end because this is my cross-country bike. And primarily the terrain that I'm riding this bike on is not so steep, not so gnarly, kind of more rolling terrain. And so I actually want my front end a little bit lower so that when I stand up and I want to kind of shred, I'm not feeling like I'm sitting in the back seat. Where if I take this bike into steeper terrain like we did today, I feel like I've really maybe got a little bit too low of a front end and it's a little bit more of a struggle for me. So if we rode terrain like we did today more consistently, I might be looking at a higher rise bar or messing with spacers underneath my stem.
Awesome. And then, so on the contrary, so as you mentioned, he's got the 20 mil rise area handlebar, and he's also got the Raceface turbine SL stem, which has a 6 mil adjustment, so you can flip the stem either direction. He's even got that on the low setting, so -6. So we're talking real low. And then you mentioned like today, in case you have ridden out here in Southern Utah, we rode Grafton D8, so pretty steep, chunky, tons of square edge hits. So that's what we rode today. Joel handled business on the 120 mil bike with that low setup. But if you were hypothetically to ride that more often, regardless of what my setup is, like what are some changes on your specific bike that maybe you would do?
Yeah, so obviously if that was the terrain I was gonna ride with this bike more often, or if we pulled my enduro bike out, I think my enduro bike would probably look a lot more similar to your setup. Because generally speaking, if I'm on a bike with a lot of front travel, a lot of rear travel, a little bit longer front end, I'm usually on steeper terrain on that bike. And so I want to maintain my position. And one of the ways I can maintain my position is with a better cockpit setup. And so on my enduro bike, you would see a bit taller front end, maybe with a higher rise bar, maybe with stem spacers. But yeah, absolutely. If I was going to do lap on lap with that bike and go right back right now, I could probably be in a more comfortable position if I were to do something as simple as run a higher rise bar, or maybe just in this case, flip that stem.
Awesome. So with you and the athletes who you're coaching, it mostly comes down to that maintenance of body posture. And as you and I chat about with your ride, you're trying to maintain a good posture so that way you're in the strongest position possible.
That's right.
So really what this handlebar setup comes down to, whether in my instance I have the 40 mil rise era bar, he's got the 20 mil rise era bar, And on the flatter terrain, you're over the bike more, you have great front wheel traction, you're able to be in an attack position and be ripping. And then in my specific instance, like the bike I'm riding here today, the Ari Delano, I have a bunch of spacers under here, 40 mil rise bar with the neutral stem. This is set up so that I'm in a comfortable attack position on that steeper terrain. So that's what Joel and I are both looking for. And I mean, I'm not a coach. I share my thoughts on YouTube, but for you with your athletes, we're really just trying, both of us in different capacities, how can we be the most confident riders that we can be out there on terrain and have the most control over our bikes. And your handlebar rise is a massive step to getting into that comfortable position. And this is something, and maybe share your opinion on this, but for me, this has come with trial and error, and it's something I continually mess with, as you may have seen if you're a regular viewer of the channel. So I don't think that there's necessarily a formula where you can be like, yo, you need this bar, because frame geometry with reach and stack ratio comes into this. Yep. But what would you maybe say for like a viewer, if you're maybe curious, like, oh, could I get more performance at? Like, what would be your mindset there?
So I think, you know, with bike setup and even with technical coaching, I think it's about making purposeful compromises, right? And so in this instance, I run that lower front end, knowing that in steeper terrain, there's a compromise there. It's not probably the ideal setup for me in that terrain. But the compromise being is when we go ride flatter terrain, you're feeling like maybe you're a little bit back seat and you really got to exaggerate to stay kind of where you want to on the bike.
Or even on that climb today. Exactly. We're going through washboard, steep terrain. You're in a much better position, comfortable. I'm a little bit more back seat.
Yeah, so it's about purposeful compromise. And then I think when we do approach setup, whatever it happens to be, in this case, we're talking about rise, is we use just bracketing where possible, right? And so if I want to kind of know what my sweet spot is and make a purposeful compromise, we might go to the extreme end. Not everybody has the luxury of being able to pull out multiple sets of handlebars, but we could use stem spacers and go on a ride, slam the front end, see where that is purposefully compromised, purposefully better, and then go back and hit the same lap and run that stack really, really tall using spacers. And like I said, there's no perfect setup on a bike. It's about purposeful compromise. And really what we're encouraging athletes and riders to do is just be aware of their position and their terrain and just make a decision based on what they primarily find themselves on. And don't be afraid to experiment. You know, this is a process that we're going through constantly, and it's just part of the fun of riding a bike.
Just to touch back on the last point you made, I love what you said about the bracketing. Could you just maybe give a quick overview of that, just for a viewer who might not understand that phrase?
So bracketing is essentially, we want to find the outer limits or the extremes for, let's say in this case, bar rise. And so on my bike, maybe I don't have multiple sets of handlebars, but I could run my stem completely slammed, in this case, -6 mil, and I can go out, and I would probably assume it might be better on a fire road climb and on flat terrain, and assume it might be worse on steeper terrain. I could go out and experiment and see what's comfortable for me, come back and do the same lap with all of my spacers underneath my stem, so I've got a few mil to play with on top of my stem there. And the reason I leave that there is for the opportunity to play with. And again, it's about just recognizing that there's a compromise to be made either way. And I would say the exact same compromise and the exact same bracketing strategy can be applied to anything. It can be applied to your suspension. And in my context, we apply it with all kinds of technical and skills and tactical kind of decision-making stuff when we go out and we work with clients and we work with athletes. If we want to say break early, well, let's test those extremes and use bracketing and see where does it make me safest, where does it make me fastest, and where is there an overlap. And I think the general themes we see in coaching world is where we see that overlap. If you imagine kind of like the Venn diagram of like safe, fast, whatever, that's kind of where like the general rule of like break early comes in. But again, in a performance context, we want to know how early or how stiff the suspension needs to be or how tall the front end needs to be in order to get the best possible performance. And usually performance and safety are actually one and the same, and that has been my experience.
Yeah, and totally, like building off what you just mentioned there, as you go through this, and if you're new to playing around with cockpit setup, I loved what you said about going to extremes with your stem spacers. In my instance, I have 30 mils here. That's a huge amount of adjustment. Like if I were to toss all my spacers up on top here, my bike is gonna feel way different.
A chopper.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's gonna go from being the chopper now to being way more low. And as you guys saw in that the Timp bike build, excuse me, when I was working on, so that's this bike over here, just for reference. So I got a 55 mil rise bar. I'll put on some B-roll of the Cockpit setup so you guys can have for reference. So I got a 40 mil stem, 55 mil rise bar, and I was trying to hit a 62-degree angle from the spindle to the bar, and I was playing with all sorts of different spacer setups. I walked through, I calculated the angle for every single different one. So that way I at least had a good starting point. But then as you kind of go through this process and learn that feeling, maybe you need to start with making a 30 mil change.
Totally, yeah, a dramatic change.
Exactly, and you can narrow down as you learn taste. Like for me, when I built up my RE Nebo Peak, which is my lightweight e-bike earlier this year, honestly, I kind of wish I had left myself some more spacers, just to be straight with you. And I had put a 2.5 mil just to have a little bit of extra before the top cap. Dude, and I was riding that bike first lap, I was like, I need that 2.5 mil spacer. And I was like, man, I'm such a doofus. Like I should have given myself some more room.
I think everyone has made that mistake. Right? Everyone has made the mistake of building their bike, and then 2 weeks later, they've got like way too many spacers on top of their stem, and it's just embarrassing and unsafe. And then we've all made the mistake of cutting them too short as well.
100%. And that's really where having these handlebar options come in as well, because you can make a mistake like that, you can adjust accordingly. So in the Aero lineup from Raceface, so we've got here a few of the different bars. So we got 20 mil, 40 mil, and then as I mentioned with the e-bike, they have up to 55. So there's tons of room for adjustment there, regardless of where your spacer setup is. So say you bought a bike used, or even you bought a bike new that comes pretty slammed with the stem, you can go for a 55 mil rise bar. I really dig the way the 55 mil rise looks, like, to be honest. So like on this bike, I got the 40 with 30 mils of spacers. On the e-bike, I just have 10 with the 55.
With the monster.
So like we're kind of actually, I think this is a little
pretty much
higher.
in the same spot.
But I just think the 55 looks cool.
It does look pretty good.
You know, there's some aesthetic aspects there. So
somewhere between flat and DAC.
Exactly. So then just to touch on that, like back to the spacers, like do you have, when you're working with athletes, like spacers are an easy adjustment, but do you have any strong opinions on doing spacer rise versus handlebar rise? Like what's kind of your feeling there?
You know, I think it really depends, right? In the case of an athlete, you know, they have the luxury of being able to try all the different bars. And I think really where the rise has a bigger impact is when you're playing with bar roll. Right? Because that's going to change the geometry more dramatically than a lower rise bar. It's going to change where the grips are. I think in most consumers' case, it's just easier to experiment with the spacers because, you know, you get one set of bars, you leave yourself a little bit of room on your steer tube, and you have that latitude to play with. I wouldn't say that I have a super strong opinion other than aesthetically, I have an opinion. But we are very different ages, and like I'm driving my kids to school and you're out like riding Rampage. So we fit into different demographics, but I think really it does come down a little bit to aesthetics, but when we're talking about bar roll as well, that's where having different rises can have a more pronounced impact on the geometry of your bike.
Yeah, absolutely. And for you, like what is your general technique with setting up bar roll?
So like I said, I think it's about understanding the rider and understanding the rider's terrain. You know, and so like I mentioned with my own bikes, my bar roll, generally speaking, is relatively forward. And I think that that's more a reflection of my personal body position. Like I'm out coaching all the time, talking about position and elbows and where they should be. And so over the years of coaching and almost exaggerating that position, it's where I tend to find myself. And it's actually where I feel safest and most comfortable as well.
Just like more attack position.
Yeah, exactly. And also I've just got big monkey arms. So I'm just able to get there more easily. And so I have found that my setup tends to be relatively rolled forward bars. I can run a relatively low front end. And it's a reflection of my position and the terrain I tend to ride. If I was riding really gnarly stuff all the time, and when I was younger, I did run a taller stack. And over the years, as I've kind of gotten a little bit mellower and I'm not riding quite as aggressively, I can run the lower front end and it keeps me in that aggressive position. And that's just been really comfortable for me. And to be honest with you, just because I've been doing it a certain way for a long time, I should really be taking my own advice too. I should be pulling out the 40 mil rise. I should be putting a bunch of stem spacers underneath.
It's easy to get complacent.
Totally. And I think that that's something that we all do, especially as we get older, as we get set in our ways a little bit. And that's why the bracketing piece is so valuable, because you can feel a really significant difference. And it doesn't mean it's right or wrong, but if you do one stem spacer, you might not even notice. If you do 3, it's unmistakable.
Or even just an extreme forward bar roll to a rearward to a neutral. It's good to find those preferences. And I guess for me, I know some of you guys have been commenting, like as I've been chatting about rider area distance and the angle and bar setup over the past few weeks and past few bike builds. Some of you guys have been like, yo, like, how do you get the best bar roll? And I know some people have even commented on like trying to find contraptions to like get it straight to the fork angle and stuff. And I think that's dope. For me, I just set my bike up against a wall. I try to get the about the bar roll angle about in line with the fork. That's kind of like a neutral spot. And then if I need an adjustment, I was playing a little bit around actually on this bike. So this bike's 480 reach, which is a touch. I know your bike's around 470 and we're similar in height. So 480 is a touch on the long side for me, hence the taller front end, which we'll talk about in a second. But I was actually playing around on this bike with some negative roll just to try to shorten that feel a little bit. And dude, the steering was so weird for me. Like, I couldn't hang.
Really can have a pretty significant impact.
Absolutely. For sure. So that went away pretty quick. And that brings me to the next point I want to talk about, which is as you go up in height and then losing some horizontal reach. Because if you think about with the bar roll or spacers, regardless of how you're going up with your cockpit. So on this bike, I believe it's a 64, 65 degree head tube angle. Put it the exact amount on the screen right now, but that bar is going up. So if you're at a neutral roll and you're at that 64 degree angle, hypothetically, that's gonna lose. So you're gonna go up, but you're gonna lose a bit of horizontal distance, which I really enjoy because for me, a big feeling, we didn't really talk about this on the ride, but when I hop on a bike, so like for my free ride bike, like 440 reach modified, it's small, dude. But I love that because I
don't want to ride it.
Exactly. But dude, I can go hop down and I can manual it down the street. Where this bike, I can't quite do that. But that's kind of my feel. Like when I hop on a bike and I'm feeling for cockpit setup and just overall confidence. Like on this bike, 140, 150. Say there's like a roller on a trail. I want to be able to like lift up and manual that easy. But I don't necessarily have to be able to manual this on flat ground.
That's right.
So I'm happy to have that kind of wheelbase extended cockpit kind of compromise as you chatted about. So with this all being said, part of the reason I have 30 mil of spacer and a 40 mil rise bar on this bike is to lose some of that horizontal distance. So it's a 480 reach bike, which is a touch longer for my personal preference. But I'm able to get it feeling really good with this cockpit setup. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, you know, really it kind of goes back to what we talked about, which is purposeful compromise. You know what I mean? Like, you know, you're going above and beyond the compromises that the average rider and even the average athlete is making, right? You've gone to the extremes in terms of like understanding your rationale for running exactly that setup. And I think really what we're trying to encourage today is this sort of like this play, right? We have these amazing tools, we have these amazing products, and just kind of, like I said, making those compromises purposefully. You know, again, as a different rider with a different style, like I'm kind of less concerned with being able to manual, you know, I can manual well enough. I would say like I can manual functionally, you know, I'm not going to be the guy manualing down the road at the end of the ride, but I can manual well enough on a trail where if there's a set of rollers, I can rhythm them, right? But really for me, my compromise is I'm less concerned about manualing. And as a guy who wants to get home to pick up his kids, I want front end grip. And so my bike is set up with that compromise. Like it is less playful and it is a little bit longer in the front end, but allows me to just be more, in my opinion, in my experience for my riding style, just more biomechanically efficient, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, that's just kind of been my preference. But the way you're compromising and the way I'm compromising, like I said, the importance there is that it's purposeful either way, and it's specific to our terrain and it's specific to our riding style. And even after spending some time together on the trail, I can see the differences in our riding position. And mind you, you don't know what my position is because you're way off in front of me, but
you don't give yourself enough credit.
But there is that difference, right? Which I think is important.
Totally.
You know?
And I love like one thing that Joel said about his coaching today is he can mention something on the trail and be recommending an athlete to something. And if he doesn't have the rationale to back it up, then like, why should an athlete believe him? And I think just in our conversation right now, you and I both have great explanations for why we have this bar set up. We've tested other things. We know what we're looking for. And I really think that as you're choosing a cockpit setup, and say you bought a complete bike, you're watching this video, you're struggling with your bike feel. We're chatting about some effects that different bar rises have. So maybe you can find an answer to be more comfortable, because we just want people to be having a better time out there on the trail. And that brings me to kind of the next thing I wanted to say, which if you're like either a young kid or just like a fan of the sport and you see someone like Dak Norton who's running, like I think he's on a 70 mil rise bar, something high, or like you see, I've actually received, it's crazy, a bunch of comments about Jackson Goldstone with a forward bar position. People wondering if I've tried it. And you can see people running these different bar setups, but they're going to have reasons of their own, but also it comes down a lot to frame geometry. So obviously you have your horizontal reach, and I'll toss a little diagram to explain this on the screen right now for you guys, but you also have your vertical stack, and the ratio of those two numbers makes a huge impact with how upright your bike is sitting. So with your bike, that bike actually has a higher reach stack ratio than my bike does. So if I were to take this exact same bar setup, toss it on his bike, it's gonna feel, actually I'd have to do the math with the fork and everything, but hypothetically it should feel a little bit more upright than my bike, just off the cuff speaking here. So that's a huge impact. So I would really warn people, like, I mean, aesthetically, if you think it looks dope, and psychologically, maybe it's going to make you ride good.
Looking good is at least half the battle.
Yeah, exactly. But I wouldn't necessarily just go copy someone's bike setup from some different manufacturer, because on your own bike, it's going to ride different. I think testing, having a rationale, as Joel and I have spoken about today, is really key here.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's the challenge with, we were talking about earlier, with bike fitting. You know, we have people come to us and there's kind of this old school way of doing bike fitting where you're sitting in the shop and we pull out a tape measure and we can do things really, really technically and amazing. But without knowing somebody's terrain, without knowing how somebody rides their bike, what their position is, you know, our experience has been you can actually be miles off with those bikes, with those bike fits, unless you're sitting on flat ground, you know, and where those bike fits came from, if you look historically, it comes from the roadside. And so, and even on the roadside, we're starting to see some real outside the box thinking. So, you know, just, in our world, I think, like I said, it's really just about understanding why you're making compromises and having the rationale for that compromise. And I would say the same thing can be said across everything that we do at Blueprint, which is from bike fitting, but even technical coaching, suspension setup, all those bits and pieces. It's all about compromise. And it's just about doing things in a deliberate way. And then hopefully, if you can, you know, being objective about what you like about them. Because I think, like, if I could ride like Dak, I would run whatever he told me to.
Absolutely.
You know, or, you know, and so, but it's not really necessarily going to give me the outcome I want if I'm not doing it purposefully. Because I know I don't ride like Dak, and I know I don't ride the same terrain like he does. So it doesn't necessarily make sense. So like I said, it's purposeful compromise.
Awesome. And then I guess, like, for instance, when you built up this bike, like, what made you be like, okay, turbine SL stem, that bar? Like, what, when you look at the bike in the stand, you're going to cut the fork, you're going to make all these big decisions. For you, what's, like, do you have a feeling? Are you making a measurement? Like, what's making you make that initial decision?
Yeah, so we talked on our ride. We have kind of a different approach to how we would set up our bikes. So I know for me, I have the luxury, like you, of having a bunch of mountain bikes. And so, you know, one thing that I'm really fussy about is actually stem length. You know, I think you're a little bit more fussy about the reach side of things. And for me, I like to keep my stem length consistent between bikes, because when I steer, I want that feeling from bike to bike to be identical. And then also, I know that in general, I prefer a relatively low front end. I know that in the case of these Commercial bikes, they tend to be a little bit taller, longer head tubes. And so having the opportunity to have a negative rise stem allows me to run a stem spacer, which works better with this particular headset and internal routing. So it allows me to run that spacer, but have the bars in the exact spot I want, where even if aesthetically the 40 mil looks better, it's actually going to be, the compromise will be, I look cooler, but I may be in a worse position unless we're riding terrain like we did today. You know, and in this particular instance, like, I wanted my Tempo to be my cross-country bike, even if it's not a cross-country race bike. For me, this is my cross-country bike. It's meant to be light, fast, rolls quickly. If I want something for chunder and for gnarly stuff, I have the luxury of another bike. But what's going to be the same between them, in all the cases of my bikes, same bar, same stem length, not necessarily the same stem. And same grips. And for me, that allows me to hop on all of my bikes and they steer identically, even if the stack is a little bit different and even if the reach is a little bit different. And I think you differ from me.
But I have to say, like, so today we're just, like, obviously pedaling up the hill, chatting as you do when you're on a ride. And one thing that Joel said to me today, which I thought was super great, is I was like, man, so he mentioned he runs a 50 mil stem on every bike. I'm like, dude, you run that, like, regardless of the reach? Because, like, for me, that's so backwards. And he's like, yeah, dude, but the steering radius is the same on all the bikes. And I love that, because for me, I actually, on my Nebo, so that's a 474 mil reach, which is kind of like, on the longer side, but still pretty happy with that. And I was like, okay, I'm just gonna toss a 32 on just to see. And dude, I couldn't believe like the understeer and like how much I had to weight the front. Like I was like, dude, this is crazy, the difference. I'd never really ran a 32 before. So I was thinking about that when you said that. So his rationale, and you can speak on this, is with the 50, is that way his steering is the same across all the bikes. And that's something, that's an input riding wise that you're sensitive to.
Yeah, totally. And I think too, it's just, you know, recognizing like, you know, that I want that steering feel to be the same regardless. And when the reach or the stack changes a little bit, well, the reason why they change, for me at least, is I want the reach and stack different on my enduro bike because the terrain is different, even if the rider is the same. And I want it different again on my downhill bike because the terrain is different again. And so I don't mind the reach and the stack changing a little bit as long as, like I said, like my touch points and that steering radius is the same. For me, that feels a lot more comfortable. Whereas if I was messing with stem lengths and even bar widths, I'm sensitive to, things just sort of change. And as a guy who's always talking about technique, it's hard to get out of your own head when you're a skills coach. And so if the bars are even 10 mils wider, I go from 760 to let's say 770 on a downhill bike, I actually feel it. And I feel like when I'm trying to do technical coaching, it has an impact on me. So I'm definitely very sensitive to that one. And I guess I'm weird to you and you're weird to me. But like I said, it's all about being purposeful in what you're doing. And for me, I'd be more sensitive to the different stem length than I would be the reach, because I know I want the reach to change because my enduro bike rides completely different terrain, you know, and I could run that 50 mil stem on today's trail with different reach and stack on my enduro bike. And, you know, suspension travel aside, just where my position is with that setup, I'd be way more comfortable.
Absolutely.
I'll take the bigger tires in the suspension though too.
For sure. So yeah, in contrast to that, like for me, and as you guys have heard me ramble on about on the channel, so I like to measure what some people call rad, which that name's kind of whatever. Some people say spread.
It's a good name.
Yeah, some people say spread, like whatever. So anyways, you do like rubber band here and here, string across, and then measure to the spindle. And then I'll measure like height from the spindle to the ground, and then the middle of the line to the ground to get my effective stack here. Then I'll use the length of that as the hypotenuse, find the angle. I do all that stuff. So nerdy, but essentially that's a static measurement, which that's obviously going to change depending on your sag points. I run, typically I'm around 20%, so like stiffer setup. But essentially what that gives me the confidence of is and some people have commented on my rad video, is like some people say you can like stand, put your hand here, and then like that's your rad, which hypothetically makes sense because that'd be your strongest position. I haven't had the most luck with that, so I don't promote that. I like it as a reference point. I like having my rider area distance and rider area distance angle from trial and error of a few different bikes. And I'm in a privileged position as you are, where we're able to ride a bunch of different bikes, and I've measured my rad and the rad angle of my last 10 bike builds. Awesome. So I have like an Excel spreadsheet, like I'm dialed with my data, and it's nice to have that to build off of. So then like when I'm gonna build up a new bike, I can be like, okay, I know I want an 86.5 centimeter rad, roughly at this angle, then I'll ride it and dynamically see how that feels. Leave myself some space. I can adjust from there.
Totally. And I think, just like I said, there's a process there. And what I like about that approach is it's objective, right? For you anyway, right? And I think that, you know, and I think that there's always a blend of the two things, right? Like, and that's always what we're trying to combine with bike setup is, you know, we want it subjectively to have certain characteristics, and then objectively, it is an engineered piece of equipment. It needs to perform as it was designed to perform. And bike setup can have a huge impact on that. And what's tricky is, like I said, we have this product engineered to perform in a certain way, but then, you know, riders, even riding the same trail today, ride it completely different at different speeds, you know, on different bicycles, and honestly, just like different positions. So there's a little bit of, you know, there's definitely some objectivity and some science and some evidence, sort of evidence-based ways to approach setup. And then there's also like the art of bike setup. And that's kind of like where, like I said, things like bracketing for somebody who's new to bike fitting is honestly the best place to start, you know, because if I adjust your suspension, for example, although that's not the topic today, but if we changed your stack by 2 mil, honestly indiscernible to a lot of folks. But if we change it by 30 mil, instantly you're going to be able to recognize the compromises that you're making and where it's good and where it's bad. And then ultimately it's just about making, you know, a more informed decision about what handlebar rise you're running, and really just being as stoked as possible while you're riding, which really at the end of the day, that's everyone's goal. Whether you're a free rider, a racer, or an old guy just trying to get home to pick up his kids, it's just about having as much fun as you can. And with the right setup, it's more fun, you know, and the bonus is usually fun and safe.
I was going to say that. Like all this boils down to, we're trying to keep people stoked, smiling, safe, and feeling confident. And Cockpit setup can make a huge impact on that, and that's why we wanted to hang out and make this video. Obviously, Joel and I have slightly different takes on certain things, but we have rationales behind all of them, and going through your process to find out your reasoning behind your choices is the key of all of this. So yeah, we're just trying to keep people stoked, safe, and smiling. So appreciate you coming on the channel today, man. Cheers. I had an absolute blast riding with you. And yeah, thank you again to Raceface for connecting us. It's really great getting to work with awesome brands who, as you guys saw in my tint build, I'm a little bit crazy. They sent me 3 different bar rises.
Some people or whatever, you know.
So super thankful for my supportive sponsors for making stuff like this happen. And yeah, thank you guys for watching. Let us know your thoughts on handlebar setup down in the comments below, and we'll see you next week for another upload.
Cheers.
Peace.